So should cover the whole playing field. Let's start off with just it's a bit of I know it's a bit of a rhetorical question, and some of it has been covered in the conference. But will central banks issue cryptocurrencies, and how likely is this? Zon, would you like to kick off with that one?
So I think it's inevitable, and I think it's going to happen.
Can we get a mic?
Can
we just? Okay.
Hello?
Great.
Yeah, okay, that works. I think it's inevitable. And the reason I say that is that whenever a new technology comes, the first thing that people do is back off. So for instance, when we had the example of using abacuses as calculators, right? When there was something that was better than an abacus, people said, no, let's use our abacus. And then they would check to see that their abacus calculations were correct, on a calculator. But then after a while, then you totally disregard your abacus. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen an abacus in this room type of thing. So it's just a matter of time where you see there's a technology that serves its purpose or the purpose of money better. It's a matter of time.
Great. Anyone else who'd like to add to that?
Yes, I think I'll add something. I think it's quite possible that central banks may want to issue their own digital currencies on top of, for example, the Bitcoin blockchain, and use protocols like delayed proof of work. The reason is because it will be easier for them to secure those national currencies, rather than them trying to take the burden of replicating a secure cryptocurrency network. I think in the long run, particularly in Africa, they'll simply just peg the digital currencies on the public blockchain.
Great, thanks.
And I think you can see the example, People's Bank of China, right, has already said they will do this. And in their official paper, they laid out the steps by year from 2017 all the way to 2018, what they're going to do to make it happen. And given the volume of activities on Bitcoin and just reality that central bank want to see the activities of payments and be that control, especially in an economy like China, the central bank will have no choice but inevitable to create their own digital currency so they can actually see the activity and who are the individuals that are doing those things.
Perhaps, what you're saying goes to the root of why you'll find the sovereign regulating any activity and or supervising, to the extent that there's always some potential for something that may adversely affect society, the sovereign will step in. And because the movement of money or something of value like that involves the central bank, it is inevitable that they will play a role if this thing grows big. And it has the potential of having catastrophic effects if it goes wrong. I'm not saying it will go wrong. And those circumstances make it ripe for the central bank to do something and play in this space.
Great, thanks. I think we've heard a little bit about there's a view that the UK authorities have taken quite a liberal view to regulation, and we know I know BitX themselves have access to the UK sandbox. Is that a model to replicate for the regulators to create that sandbox environment for startups and entrepreneurs and innovators to actually go and test their proposition? And is that something we should be looking at in South Africa and Africa?
Sure. So I'd like to just take a step back, though, first of all, and just talk about regulators, first of all, because there have been a few institutions that have been taking a bit of a bashing during the past couple of days.
Set the record straight.
No, I think it's important for us to understand why we have regulators, right? As society, we choose to have regulators. It's not just regulators just sprung up and then now we hate them and trying to get rid of them. That's not the case at all. The purpose of a regulator is to protect the interests of society. Now, to the extent that regulators are not doing their job, or they're doing it inefficiently or not appropriately, that's a separate discussion. But I think we get confused when we see that certain regulations are not serving the purpose as they should be, and then we decide, no, let's get rid of regulators completely. And I fundamentally disagree with that thought process, because I think it's a flawed thought process. And I think we all benefit from having regulators, good regulators. That's just one thing to say, that I think regulation is an important thing that will continue so long as we have societal order. So when you have orders, you need regulators, etc. So we can talk about that more if people want to. But given that, if their regulator's purpose is to actually serve society, then they need to understand the new technologies. Then they need to start playing around and understanding it and testing it before it actually goes live. So it's absolutely a model to follow, and I think most central banks are actually starting to follow that model so that they can learn before they actually start implementing any solutions.
So there's a component of education within that. So and it's a quid pro quo. It's the education that perhaps the innovators bring to the table, but at the same time the regulators create an environment for the innovators to experiment.
Correct.
The kind of regulator you're talking about, for example, who is prepared to look at innovation is one that is enlightened.
Sure.
The ones that we come across most of the time when you come with something new are stuck in a particular way of seeing things, and they will not move with the kind of speed that the innovation is moving. I think what will create more of a push towards getting the regulators to do something here is, so our law recognizes the sanctity of contracts. If you and I enter into a contract and we want to do something, the law will respect that. And until such time that we have a fallout, we are the ones as the people who invite the state to get involved, either through the courts or through regulation. And we say, listen, this thing here has gone wrong. And the regulators or the state begins to say, we must regulate this because what is happening here is not right. So that may be what gives more of a push towards how the regulators come into the space. Proactively, probably they'll move slightly slow, because how do they work? We've got this much work to do, and this thing doesn't look like it's a problem. We hear about it, but it doesn't look like it's a problem. And I think there may be pull and push factors for them to descend into the blockchain arena.
Well, I think, there is a saying that regulation follows innovation, and there's a reason for that. And, you can't create the rules for the benefit of, bigger community without actually knowing what the things are.
Yeah.
And I think Elizabeth either talk about, right, everybody recognizes that everything is software driven now, right? Software and data driven and enabled, and that the world is more and more connected from consumer to institutional side. And the sandbox that are being created is a way for the UK regulators to become quickly informed about what's happening out there, so that they can then think about what rules that they can, what if any rules, new rules that need to put in place. And I don't think there has been any new regulations, right, that come out in any country that said, well, you can't do this or you can do this with respect to private blockchain in financial services. No regulator has put out anything like that. They're still in the phase of learning. And the question is not always, well, we need new regulation because of new technology. And that has always been kind of a topic in a lot of the panels is, what do we need new regulations for these new systems? And a lot of the law firms will tell you that it's not new regulations, it's just the way with which regulation has to be adapted and thought through and integrated with some of the things that are happening to be reflected in the implementation of the new regulations. So I think UK is definitely more forward thinking. I think US regulators have not been as proactive in putting out sandbox to do these kind of things.
Just to add to that, in the case of Kenya and Uganda, the central banks only issued warnings when it became apparent there were a lot of scams, multi-level marketing scams. So I think they've been a big progressive because they've only stepped in when problems have arisen. And I mean, that's how M-Pesa grew so big. The CBK took quite a bit of time before they began to set a policy for a national law to be sort of implemented. So I think central banks in Africa are realizing the opportunity, given what they've seen with the success of digital broadband and mobile money telephone.
That's great. Thanks. Fazlon, do you think there's more we could be doing, just perhaps in the South African context in terms of creating that sandbox for people to experiment and play in with the regulators, or do you think we're sort of tracking quite well in our current engagement with them?
So I think, to my knowledge, we've got wise regulators in this country. And those regulators are actually trying to understand and have taken steps to understand. And that knowledge that they're gaining will inform their steps as they move forward. I think, especially in the blockchain world, I think we all know there is an incredible amount of hype, right? And it's kind of a war of press releases, if you want to look at it that way. And it's not just the startups, it's regulators, everybody's trying to kind of say, look at us, we're doing the best. I don't know if that's such a great thing in the long run. Okay, great, you've got your name out there. But I think we shouldn't discount a lot of work that is going on behind the scenes without the public necessarily being aware of it.
Fazlon, so I think what you're saying is we shouldn't really frame it in terms of an adversarial relationship and more collaborative and cooperative relationship with the regulators. Great. I think it's a good time to open this up to the audience. I know there were a lot of pent-up questions this morning that perhaps didn't get answered. So there we go, our first question.
Thanks very much for a very lively discussion. I was actually quite surprised that the feeling in the area was as adversarial as it is. Because at last year's conference, we had a presenter who was the chair of this intergovernmental committee, and the feeling was, there's a lot of collaboration happening. And up until the point that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are classified as money, then it can become a problem, because at the moment they're not money. I don't get taxed on how many bags of mealies I have in my store, or how many cattle I have, or whether I pay Lobola with my cattle, or what happens on exchange. None of that is inside the financial system. When I take my bags of mealies to the co-op and I sell them and I get money, then I declare it as an income. And at this stage, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are exactly that. They are outside the financial system. And I think it's almost a fruitless exercise that we talk about Bitcoin being money before it is. The challenge that I think we should be addressing, and we touched on that today, but it's almost in passing, is the new generation products that are going to be developed that live on a blockchain and how to regulate those. I think that's where our challenge lies in the future. Challenge doesn't lie here now, because exchange control, flight of money out, capital out of a country, that can all be controlled with existing legislation through the exchanges. Somewhere we've got to change fiat to Bitcoin, Bitcoin to fiat. Personally, I think it's pretty much under control. If I had to fill in a report and say, this year I've spent 160,000 Rand buying Bitcoin, it's easy, it's traceable, KYC is in place, everything's there. It's not an issue. But if I say, well, I've purchased this product that's now insuring my household content and I'm paying for it in Bitcoins, and that becomes a problem. I'd like your opinion on that, and whether this is not just a fruitless discussion talking about Bitcoin as money when it's not, legally.
Adrian, next. Anyone like to respond?
Should we take like 2-3 questions?
Yeah, sure. Adrian, you want to fire away? Sorry, not to not answer your question. That was great.
Sure. Well, I'm kind of building on that because I want to partly dispute what's been said. It's not declared as money today, and that, in my opinion, and I'm not an expert, but that means then exchanges that are selling Bitcoin should be charging VAT. And so if it's not money, it's goods. And if I'm buying goods from somebody, then there should be VAT involved somewhere. So we need to figure out what it is and decide, because that has big tax implications either way. Personally, I'd prefer it was money. Just treat it like another currency. It's like dollars, it's like euros. It's just, it's another currency that, as South Africa, we have no control over the issuance. We know how the issuance works, but we have no control over it. Just like dollars, euros, any other currency. Because then we can get beyond all of this, what is it, gray area, what do we do with it, and just start using this stuff. Any cryptocurrency is money, just use it as money, and let's start building on top of that.
Adrian, great, thanks for that. And I think perhaps just to direct the panel's response a little bit, and there is, there has been in certain circles this debate, is Bitcoin actually a commodity? Or is it a currency? Where are we on that? Anyone can take that. Yeah.
I think the proven use case is a store value. People leveraging it as an asset. And the benefit of that is it allows for economic expansion, particularly in areas where there was no visibility on what's going on. So, like the example I gave of the young guy trading and hedging Bitcoin, at some point he will need to convert his Bitcoin to fiat. And at that point he joins the formal economy, so to speak. So I don't think government will regulate too worried what happens there, because eventually they'll be able to see the end result of what's going on in those sort of small pockets.
Yeah, I think for the challenge we face when we are thinking about it, whether it is money or what, is we're stuck in definitions. And these definitions are formally set out by regulators. So when you look at it, it may not fit in within that definition, but you have a sense of its characteristics and how it behaves. Now, if we look at it today, let me talk about in South African terms. I would say to you, it is not money because it is not defined as such. But because there's so much value, say in the case of Bitcoin, that moves between parties, what are we going to call it? It is a product. But what kind of a product is it? I could say it is a financial product, but if I go and look at the definition of a financial product, wherever it is designed, it is not necessarily in there. But there may be a place where you could, you could, if you stretch the language, and courts are not in the business of stretching the language, you could probably draw it in. But this is where I think it will become a bit of a challenge, and there may be push or pull factors for wanting to recognize it somewhere. There was a question here today about whether, so how would you treat it in the world of pension funds? And you say, look, somebody goes to pension funds and says, if you stick your money in there, look at what has been happening. And they will say, but what do we call this? Because there are regulations around where we could put our money. And it is possible that at some point someone may say, look, it is not money, but it is certainly a financial product. There is something similar in there which are Krugerrand's money. But they are a product you can invest in. So what about something as digital as Bitcoin, cryptocurrency? Why couldn't you treat it like that? But our biggest challenge as far as I'm concerned, is we are stuck in formal definitions. That's why we have this trouble. But I think in time, as this thing becomes more of a norm, we will find a way of bringing it in without necessarily calling it money.
Maybe to add on to that, I think we should ask ourselves, why do we care whether we call it money, commodity, property?
Exactly.
And to your point, I mean, it's being classified as different things in different jurisdictions, and there's no consensus what it is. But let's ask ourselves again, why? Who cares? Like, if I call Bitcoin money or a commodity, is that going to change the way you're going to buy it or use it? No. Right? Exactly. So it's tax, and also beyond tax is who can actually deal with it. So if it's classified as a security, for instance, then you've got the Financial Markets Act that comes in, etc. So on the tax thing, and actually I want to address this. There's someone, a few people said that they would love to pay zero tax. Who would love to pay zero tax in the room? Okay. So I would love you guys, if you had the opportunity, to go to a country where you pay zero tax
None.
and tell me what life is like there.
Yeah.
All right? Because you have no roads, you have no services, etc. So in economics, we have this concept of a public good, right? And a public good is something that everybody uses, but actually costs need to be incurred for it to be built, i.e. your road. You don't pay, well, maybe that's not a good example over here at e-tolls, but generally. So tax itself as a society is actually a very good thing. But what we actually rebel against is the authorities that we've entrusted to collect it and spend it. All right? And when we see there's corruption and there's a lack and a betrayal of trust, that's why we rebel against it and we say no more tax. But it's the same thing that I was saying about regulation. If it's done badly, we say no more regulation. But actually, what we're looking for is we actually do like tax as society. And we want it to be, appropriate, and we want it to be well used. So I think if you look in the Scandinavian countries have a very high tax rate, but you see that those taxes are being put to good use and the society is benefiting from it, etc. So tax, I think, is an important thing, and that's why we want to understand it. I think right now the regulators will try to understand it, but again, based on the assumption of serving society. So right now, if we look at our current financial system, and I think many of the things that have been said about banks are true. There are many things that are inefficient, etc. But it's not, you can't really just blame one particular group of institutions. It's actually the system we're in. So the beauty about cryptocurrencies, for instance, is when you come onto an exchange, you can do peer-to-peer exchanges, right? Whereas if you look at exchanges in our current financial system globally, you need to have brokers, you need to have tons of different central counterparties, etc. We've seen a couple of pictures on that. So the beauty of it is that we should not, from a regulatory perspective, look at what our current regulation says, for instance with securities, and now just do a copy-paste onto cryptocurrencies. That would be an absolute failure. Right? So we need to understand what we're trying to do to serve society and create certain regulations that serve the most of us. Just one last thing to say on this, and it's a personal comment. So my wife and myself are trying to think about adoption. Now my wife is an American citizen who's not a permanent resident, and therefore we cannot adopt in this country. All right? So I think to myself, oh, that's kind of strange. Why is that the case? And you talk to people and you say, well, actually there's a history of a lot of children being abused in the name of adoption. So you realize there is a need for regulation from that perspective, so that there isn't child trafficking, etc., etc. But maybe it's too much that an individual, just because they're not a citizen in a country, cannot adopt. So I just give that example to say, in that situation, I think it's clear some type of regulation is necessary, but it's the appropriate type of regulations that needs to be.
Thanks for that. Gavin, right at the back. Gavin, if it's going to be about tax, it's going to be hypothetical because you're a startup entrepreneur and you're not earning enough to pay tax at the moment, so you can be ideological.
This is true. And, one of the assumptions about tax is that it needs to be going to a central government that is going to then sort out all our needs. In a decentralized system where we can start looking at even localizing and having decentralized ownership of all the sort of infrastructure and so on, where citizens could actually even vote where money goes automatically and so on and so forth. I don't mind paying for infrastructure. It's just that currently when I'm paying tax, I don't know where it goes, what it's used for, and I can almost guarantee that a lot of it's going to just be lost in the wash. And so I think these are some of the things we can start imagining and start inventing with these decentralized systems that we have. And so this is why I stuck my hand up and said, I don't like paying tax. I don't want to pay tax because I would love to pay for infrastructure, but I'd rather crowdfund stuff and have part ownership in it and see more sort of equitable models than we currently have. So that would just be my comment on the tax stuff. And thanks, yeah, you're right, Ian.
Sorry.
Cool, thank you.
And
keep it real.
just to make a point on that, I mean, I don't think it's just, blockchain could solve that, right? And I think we misuse the term decentralized versus distributed. I see it very hard for society to go decentralized versus actually be able to use technology and, to your point, having transparency for the government to tell us how the funds are being deployed and allocated through open data. So when you have convergence of open data and technology like blockchain, you start to be able to imagine a world that you can have a distributed model where the citizens sit on, right, a node on distributed network, and the tax authority sit on another node, and another authority sit on another node, where there is a shared ledger where, to the extent that you have the permission to see the user fund and where that fund goes, right, that's the ideal world. So I don't think it's decentralized, it's distributed. And it's not just, blockchain as a panacea for that. You need open data, you need governance, you need the government to recognize that open data is not just a fashion, right? To say open data, you actually want useful data to tell citizens where the money are going for investments.
Great.
This is a very interesting topic because there's different levels that regulators need to look at. The first one is the fact that we are importing our Bitcoins from overseas. We're using our credit cards. We are paying two kinds of tax to receive our Bitcoins in our wallets. And there's a second factor, the guy that's making his own Bitcoins, his own factory. Okay, and then obviously the third thing is Bitcoin is not made by the central banks. So how do they put their finger in it? Well, we will need to pay tax. And the tax has already been paid on the first transaction and the second transaction. And if we look, my Zimbabwean friends here at the back can back me up. There were about 30 banks in Zimbabwe at one stage. How many are left of them? So maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see 80% of the banks that don't change to our new world close down. So it's adapt or change. Maybe they're going to follow our rules, not us their rules.
Sure. Adrian, just at the back, if anyone would like to comment, you can.
I want to add another data point to the regulatory thing is that if you look at the current Bitcoin exchange rates in different countries, there's massive arbitrage. And that's normally because regulators are making it difficult for people to buy Bitcoin, either by not making a decision or not saying what Bitcoin is, or just being quiet, and so people don't really know what to do and don't feel like they can operate a legitimate Bitcoin business. And if we go on the premise that regulators are intending to do what's good for society, then in my mind, a regulator who's forcing their citizens to pay a premium to buy Bitcoin is making a mistake. So if regulators are doing something that causes Bitcoin or any digital currency to cost more in their country, then they're already doing something wrong. So I think the argument that we can sit back and watch and so on is not entirely true, and is entirely based on the premise that entirely based on the fact that the volume today isn't enough for them to care. If we decided that trading Bitcoin, even Bitcoin for Bitcoin or whatever, should incur some sort of tax, and all of a sudden SARS sat up and said, wait a minute, there's a few million or a few billion rand we could be making out of this, I promise you they'd be moving. They'd be moving very fast.
Great. Anyone else like to add to the discussion? Yep, thank you.
Not so much a question as a statement. I would like to hear your opinion on. Would it be okay to say that the issue that people have with regulation isn't so much the fact that something is unregulated? If you look at the typical cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and that, and if you listen to the things he was saying, his biggest emphasis was the fact that the regulation doesn't change. Bitcoin, for instance, it's going to be produced at a certain rate and at a certain time, and it takes X amount of effort to produce X amount of Bitcoins. You can predict when the market is going to be sort of flooded, when all the Bitcoins that could be issued have been issued, and you can predict sort of at what rate that's going to happen. So, and then if you look at Ethereum, for instance, every time they fork and they change their internal regulations, you can actually see their price drop. So would you be able to say then that maybe the issue isn't so much with regulation itself as with people's worry that the regulations are going to change? And they're worried, I would imagine people would be worried more about the fact that regulations might be unevenly applied and that the people might change their minds rather than the fact that they were going to be regulated in the first place.
Well, I think you just gave a perfect example why some of the central banks want to create their own cryptocurrency, right? When you have something like Ether and, you know, when DAO happened, the price dropped, and then when you have enterprise Ethereum goes up, and I mean, the other gentleman's point about the tax, about, and those things, I mean, you wonder if any of the regulators actually are trading digital currency as an asset class. And if they are, as individuals, they would then see the discrepancy across different exchanges. They will see the taxation, lack of taxation rules, and where individuals today are relying on their own tax advisors to figure out how to report at the end of the year. So I know that's not answer to a question, but I'm not sure there's an answer to that right now.
But I think part of what we have to do is not think of appropriate regulation wearing our hat today, because the design of regulation and the behavior of regulators today is uninformed by this, what I would call new economy, really. And you can imagine if they begin to think about how to regulate this, they will be heavily influenced by what is happening in the market. You don't regulate and ignore the market, okay? And the market would be the people who are playing in this space who will be making an input and saying, look, in this space, this is what we do. And the second point would be, there is a move to regulate on principle. Set the broad principles. And the detail is something that comes with the market to inform the detail. So if there was a worry that regulators will change rules every now and then, the question is, what does that do to the market? And regulation is not indifferent to the impact it has to the market. So I'm saying, let's not think about what the regulation might be and think about it wearing today's hat. There is something, we have to move into this new world and understand what this new market is. And the appropriate regulation will emerge because the people who are playing in this space are heavily lobbying the state. I'm under absolutely no imagination that they will let the state just do as it pleases. They will lobby through various ways. And that's the way you do it.
Can I add a couple of things to that? So I think, first of all, I'd like to talk a little about regulation of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ether that are outside the ambit of a central bank. And then there's been a little bit of talk about a central bank issued cryptocurrency and what that means from a regulatory perspective. So we've all watched the movies and we've all seen when there's some type of heist that goes down. What gets transferred is a suitcase or a briefcase full of cash, right? And we don't see that and say, oh my goodness, cash is bad, let's ban cash. Right? It's an illogical conclusion to come to. And so a lot of the regulators, I think this is changing a lot globally, which is great, is that they thought, oh, Bitcoin is just all associated with the underground drug trade, et cetera, et cetera. And while, yes, I am sure that some illicit activity is being conducted via Bitcoin, it doesn't mean that Bitcoin in and of itself is a bad thing. So I always say that if a regulator's stance is let us ban this thing and this asset class, I think that is the first mistake that regulator is going to make. That is a very, very large mistake. Because you can't switch off the internet, right? And so long as people have an internet connection and they've got a private key, Bob's your uncle, right? So if you're a regulator and you ban it, then you just push it underground and you actually have no sight of it whatsoever. So why not just try to actually allow it, understand it, and actually, if I have Bitcoins and dollars, for instance, according to the Central Bank of South Africa, what I do with my dollars that are offshore or my Bitcoins offshore is actually not really relevant to the Central Bank of South Africa. Now, because of the current regulations with exchange control, etc., and we can have a debate about whether that's good or not, but that's a separate debate. Given that, one might say, listen, I actually want to know who is going in and out of Bitcoin via RANds. right? Because I want to know who's going in and out of dollars via rands already. So let's regulate it from that perspective, not to stop it at all, but just to make sure with anti-money laundering, etc., that we have a little grasp of what's going on. That's the first thing. So I think it would be unwise of any regulator anywhere in the world to ban cryptocurrencies. That's my first thing. Second thing is this idea of central bank issued cryptocurrencies. Now, it takes a little bit of a paradigm shift to understand that, because it's very, very different to what we've just been talking about, like Bitcoin and Ether, etc. And all it is, it's just money that's a different form, right? So when you think about physical cash and your money in your app, the 100 that's on your app that shows up in pixels and then disappears when you go to your BBC app, in your mind is exactly the same value as a 100 note in your pocket, right? The form is extremely difficult. You can't be, different. You can't have much of a difference in different forms. So cryptocurrency would just be a third form of government money, whose benefit would just be a great sense of efficiency for an economy. So right now, when you do transfers from your own bank to someone at your own bank, it gets reflected in their account pretty much instantaneously. Whereas when you do a transfer to someone at another bank, it takes some time to get there. But the beauty about having a cryptocurrency as a central bank issued instrument is that you actually only have one ledger now. And so all payments are as if it's on the same ledger at the same bank. And when you start looking into it, then right now, if we believe in a regulator that understands a monetary policy paradigm, and we can again have lots of discussions about that monetary policy paradigm. But right now, if we entrust a regulator to make regulations to do good for our society, then surely they would like to just have a little bit of insight on what's going on. And they try to do that. But right now, the central bank doesn't really understand all the different transactions that are happening at the same bank. They get reports about that. But with a central bank issued currency, they could see every single transaction that's taking place in an economy. So you can see Christmas Day this year, how did it compare to Christmas Day last year? And you know for sure the economy is doing better, it's doing worse, etc. So just a couple of comments on that, which is they're very different things. The regulations or issuing a cryptocurrency that's central bank issued versus the unregulated, or if you want to call them public blockchain.
Can I just say something here? Because the one thing is, we are not totally in an unregulated space, but, and it's not as if the central bank has no idea of what's happening with money, particularly the money that we use when you buy Bitcoin, because your money moves out of a bank account into something. Right there is your footprint. Okay, exactly. So it's not as if we're in a totally unregulated space. So the question you might want to ask is, isn't it just possible that the central bank takes comfort that it sees the footprints of what's going on when the money moves from one place to another. And when you bring back your money now into your bank account, again, you've got another footprint. Might that not be the level of comfort which they're taking at this time? Unless, of course, once you're in the blockchain world, something that threatens sort of the system there begins to grow. But I mean, they see what's happening. Your bank knows exactly what you've moved on what day to what. And when you bring money in, there is a record of what you're doing. And that may be a form of regulation that maybe satisfies their needs right now. I'm just posing a point.
I just want to add, I do agree that a huge incentive for central banks wanting to issue their own digital currency is to see what banks are doing.
Yeah.
In Kenya, we had a case of a bank where the CEO was taking money out of the customers' accounts to the tune of billions of shillings. And what the governor said is they would like a system that would allow them to have visibility to what's going on there. But the problem, I believe, with issuing their own cryptocurrency is that they open themselves to many attack vectors. And what I tend to think is that central banks might end up becoming Bitcoin users by buying Bitcoin, and then they would have to sort of think of regulating themselves as a Bitcoin user, which can create some contradictions.
Okay. Very last question, and then we're going to wrap.
So those with an accounting background would know of the concept of materiality. And the current market cap for Bitcoin, for example, is roughly around 18 billion or so. And that would probably be Mr. Gates' pocket change, or would be equivalent to the GDP of Zimbabwe and Malawi put together. And those are very peripheral countries. So I don't know, I'm just curious if it's worth investing so much conversation over the issue of regulation, given the materiality of the amounts that are involved and the pace at which Bitcoins are going to be issued. It's really small amounts of money we are talking about. That's number one. The second point is, since this is blockchain Africa, I'm curious about it from an Africa perspective, the issue of regulation. The first point being that from our experience, we run a Bitcoin exchange, and when we were setting this thing up, we would engage the central bank, and we knew they had no clue what this is all about. But they would say, there's no legislation for this kind of thing. So some of our guys were worried that there's no legislation, and I kept saying, it's happy days. We should be happy that there's no legislation to support that sort of thing. So we went ahead anyway to set it up and do our stuff. So for a lot of people in the Bitcoin space, I think it's a nice thing there is no regulation. And you keep talking about the sandbox, so we'll keep playing on this in the sandbox and jumping up and down and so forth in the sandbox. It's a good thing. But the second point is, my view is a lot of the conversation that was happening at the Microsoft level, Accenture and so forth, this is first world stuff. And these companies can afford to invest in all that stuff. But most central banks in Africa don't invest in that sort of thing. So they're going to wait until at some point some central bank somewhere figures this thing out, and then they'll adopt and adapt. Because I'm not aware of any central bank, perhaps north of the Limpopo, that actually invests in blockchain tech and competent IT people working on this sort of development. So they're going to wait and then capture regulations from elsewhere, and then try to adapt them on the continent. I had a conversation with this Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe a couple of weeks ago, and so they had issued a statement the same way the Kenya Central Bank issued a statement, and said that, this Bitcoin, there's no legislation for it, and people need to be careful. So I met one guy who issued a similar statement from our own central bank, and I asked him, do you actually know about Bitcoin? And I was a little bit rough with him. But eventually I figured out he doesn't know about it, but he also had to issue a statement to people so people know that at least he knows something about Bitcoin. So north of the Limpopo in Africa, there's a chance that most of the central banks are not invested in this sort of thing. And for a very long time they won't be. And they'll probably just adopt and adapt regulations from elsewhere. So I think we should be happy they don't know, and we should be happy that they have no clue what this is all about, and we should be happy that it will take them a very long time to figure this thing out. And the materiality is not worth it. To me, the materiality aspect of Bitcoin is like collecting taxes, right? If it's too expensive to be collecting the tax, why collect it? Because somebody yesterday was saying about 30,000 Bitcoins a week are traded in South Africa. And I would imagine that's the highest amount of Bitcoins traded in Africa, actually. Because I don't think in Zim we trade that much Bitcoin. And I don't think in Kenya they trade that much Bitcoin. So really, I don't know whether it's worth investing too much time talking about regulation. It's a long way off. Thank you.
So great, thanks. I think like a Zimbabwean accountant to put things in perspective.
So maybe a slightly different view is that what is the difference between a wallet right now and a bank? Okay, an internet wallet and a bank. Okay, where you have Bitcoins that are being accepted by a startup who have the private keys, and therefore it's a liability of that startup, right? I would venture to say there's actually no difference whatsoever, okay, from that perspective. Now, both startups and traditional banks work in exactly the same system where they're trying to maximize their profits. Do we agree with that? Okay? So it's the same system, same system. Some are a bit older, some are just young. Now, let's just look about what happened in China recently, right? Before the withdrawal ban, etc., about Bitcoin, what was happening on the exchanges in China? What were the fees? Zero, right? What was happening a lot? Margin trading, right? Now, a lot of these exchanges now, one has to ask oneself, because once margin trading stopped, right, then fees actually started going to 0.2%, right? Now, do you think it's likely that when you deposited a Bitcoin to some of those exchanges, that they didn't take that Bitcoin and lend it to somebody for a profit? And that therefore, when someone actually, and everybody wanted to come and take their Bitcoin at the same time, it wasn't available because it had been lent out. Now, it is early stages. But the reason we have regulators for banks is to make sure that banks do not act irresponsibly. To your point of materiality, right now it's so small that people don't care. But I promise you, everybody in this room will be crying at some point when people in the new startups start acting irresponsibly, like some of those that we're accusing right now in the more traditional institutions, and we end up in exactly the same place in 20 years hence, once the older banks have been died out and the startups are now the new banks. So we just need to be very careful with our understanding of the ecosystem and where it's moving, and why we have regulators and what we're trying to do with regulation.
Great, Fazam, thank you, very nice. Thank you very much. Any other closing thoughts from anyone? Anyone like to add anything? Great, well, a very big thank you to the panel. That was really interesting. Thank you. A lovely close to a very intellectual 2 days. So I think to close, first of all, just a very big thank you to all of you. Thanks for hanging in there for 2 days. I think it's been a big, very deep intellectual engagement. I'm sure you're all feeling a little bit exhausted. I'd just like to really thank Sonia and Theo from Bitcoin Events for putting on another really kick-ass deep domain expertise conference. I'm sure you'll agree that the subject matter and the content was very well covered. And well done in getting such a great lineup of speakers, and I think attracting such a world-class audience. I think fantastic. Thank you. No. We've got another mic. We'll switch it off quickly. Yes.
I just want to say a couple of thank yous, and I want to obviously start with Ian Merrington. I met Ian Merrington in 2015 at the very first blockchain conference we had. We've come a long way since then. We've had 3 conferences, and Ian has been the master of ceremonies for 2 years. And he's been extremely supportive of my role in this ecosystem, and I have a lot to thank you for that. So thank you, Ian. Thank you for being such a fantastic master of ceremonies. And then secondly, our sponsors. Thank you very much to SAP, and obviously CoinBR for being Andreas here. We couldn't have been more proud to have Andreas here with us this conference. And just to note as well, we started in 2015 and we called ourselves the Bitcoin Africa Conference. In the second year, we changed that to Bitcoin and Blockchain Africa Conference. And this year, we pivoted to Blockchain Africa Conference. And I'm quite excited to see what our title is going to be next year, because this is an emerging technology. It's changing very fast. And I'm not sure if it's going to be DLT conference next year or what it's going to be, but please watch this space. And then I'd also like to say thank you so much to all the speakers. We had a tremendous good feedback about all the speakers, and we really, really thank you for coming from the UK, from Kenya, from America, especially for the conference. So thank you so much. I want to pass you on to Theo, who's my partner, and you might have something else to say.
Yeah, thanks. And I think lastly, thanks to the audience as well for participating in what seems like a very long 3 days and then sort of information overload. But the good thing is that if you just listen to the conversation that was had during lunchtime and tea times, there was a lot of networking, which was fantastic. That's the whole point. People walk away from you and you've got a wealth of people that you can call whether you understand Bitcoin or whether you understand blockchain or whether you don't, it's always great to be able to interact with people. And just to finish off, we've been approached by, I think it's Nigerian, the Central Reserve Bank, to actually come and help them actually host an event in Nigeria as well. So, which is going to be fantastic. I mean, one of the biggest markets in Africa. So just watch that space, and I think it's probably going to happen in October. So thank you to everyone. Drive safely, and we'll see you hopefully next year.
Can we just thank Naz at the back? Naz, you can stand up. Thanks for running point on everything else. That's not
Thank you, Naz.
Well done, Naz. Thank you. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone.